Content warning. This story references sexual exploitation, threats, and violence. Reader discretion advised. They said the scandal belonged to private rooms and hidden ledgers. In Virginia, 1842, a senator's house kept a commerce so cold it was catalogued like livestock. Bodies bought for the sole purpose of bearing more bodies. What the polished columns and manicured lawns hid was not the quiet dignity of a family, but an industry of reproduction. This is the untold story of a senator's wife and the man who had been bought for his seed, a story in which love, shaped inside the metal teeth of slavery, becomes an act of resistance that would unravel an empire. The Witmore plantation sat like a declaration, white paint flaking only where hands had turned away from the heat, tall columns that lent the house a moral authority no one had earned. Tobacco rose spilled down the slope, brown leaves crisping in the late summer glare, insects humming in a rhythm that made the workers look like a single, patient machine. At dusk, the house threw long shadows over the yard, and in those lengths of shade the people who labored there huddled into the small places the master's light would not reach. Samuel first came to Witmore because a ledger said he was valuable. He had been assessed and priced like a gelding, only his worth had been measured by the ruthless arithmetic of fertility. The men who calculated his value had watched him forge iron, measured the calluses on his hands, and decided that a strong blacksmith might also promise strong children. That calculus had a name in the wider world: breeder. It was a word that turned a human life into a spreadsheet. Samuel was taller than most, shoulders tempered by years at the forge, and he carried a quietness like a folded handkerchief, still but ready. He had eyes that took in the world the way a man reads a map, the lines of the fence, the pattern of the overseer's steps, the weak points of a locked gate. He learned quickly which dogs were kept on thick chains, which houses had tilted shutters whose feet could be trusted by the sound. The first time he saw Catherine, she stood at the stable door with a silver cup of cider catching the afternoon light. She was not meant to be there. The stables were where the house's livestock and the enslaved workers crossed paths, a place of work and little oversight from the lady herself. Catherine's hands, the servant said, had been brushed clean of toil by a lifetime of needlework and governesses. Her face held the kind of beauty that made a plantation seem like a stage set: symmetry, pale skin, hair pinned just so. Yet something in the tilt of her head did not belong to ornament. She watched Samuel like someone reading an unfamiliar language, and in that watching there was hunger. Not for possession, but for understanding. He looked back. That glance was a small theft, a steadying, a traded fact. In a world that set men and women into boxes of ownership and duty, the recognition between them was a fissure. Samuel had been taught to lower his eyes, to make himself smaller than he felt. Catherine had been taught to command and to be admired, never to be seen as captive. The two of them had been trained to read each other as property read a title, but in the stable they began to learn each other as people. Catherine had married the senator, because marriages among the powerful were not about finding a companion. They were about consolidations. Elijah Witmore's name occupied columns of the local paper. His portrait hung in the parlor like a public warning, and his voice made laws on the floor of the Capitol. To be his wife required Catherine to be a certain ornament, speechless in some rooms, luminous in others. But an ornament she was not. She had a mind that catalogued inconsistencies. How her husband's laugh did not reach his eyes, how his speeches about liberty never included those he owned. The gilded prison of the Witmore house had a different lock for her. It was one made of expectation and rumor. They began with small things: a cup left near the stable ladder, a tool returned with an extra curl of iron, a question asked as if by accident. Their conversations were careful, stitched with a language of implications. Where others saw the rules, they began to see the seams. Samuel would talk about the metal he shaped, about the way iron takes heat and remembers it. Catherine listened, fascinated by how a man could speak of shaping without breaking. She would tell him about the books she had been allowed to read, and he would correct her historical dates with the same kind patience he showed a pupil. It was a friendship formed on margins, close enough to be real, far enough to be deniable. There, in that slow mercantile intimacy, something that was not merely convenience took root. It was not the clumsy romance of novels. It was a tenderness sown from necessity, and mutual recognition. Neither of them mistook the conditions in which it grew. There was always the knowledge of imbalance, Elijah's shadow, the ledger that had brought Samuel to the plantation, the way other servants' faces shifted when Catherine lingered beyond her station. But to see one another was to breathe differently. Against the tried machinery of ownership, they began to teach each other the grammar of human regard. When Catherine realized she was pregnant, it happened with the intimate terror of anything that could be used against them. For her, the discovery was a private shock, movement like a secret knocking inside, a memory of nights that had been both solace and danger. For Samuel, it was the consolidation of all his worries. To carry a child inside the compound of the plantation was to invite exposure. The ledger called for progeny, but not for this woman's agency. The merchant minds of the household would interpret a child's presence as an asset to the estate, or in darker bookkeeping, as a complication to be removed. They spoke in whispers under the rafters. Once, as rain pelted the roof and the house seemed to fold inward from the weather, Catherine sat in the stable with her hands pressed to her belly. Samuel stood beside her, the scent of oil and iron clinging to him like a second skin. He was as much afraid as she was. Fear there was, but there was also a planning that steadied them. In danger, their minds sharpened. This was not the first time plantations had measured human value by the number of children one might produce. In the decades since the trade in people had been woven into American commerce, owners like Elijah had adopted a brutal calculus. If the international slave trade had been closed in 1808, then domestic reproduction was the new market. Breeder systems, practices where people were purchased for their reproductive potential, were part of that tragic adaptation. For enslavers, a womb could be a ledger's promise. For those who lived inside those bodies, it was a place of profound hope and terrifying exposure. Catherine and Samuel's planning could not be open. There were methods to conceal the most ordinary gestures, books with hollowed pages, letters with coded phrases placed in borrowed rooms, a child's blanket with a stitch only a certain laundress knew to look for. They learned who in the servants' quarters had eyes that could be trusted, who would turn their head when asked. Josiah, a man who had worked the river crossings and knew how information moved like fish through nets, became a quiet conduit. He spoke in metaphors of currents and eddies, of root and shelter. He knew the names of Quaker houses, the blacksmiths who kept their doors closed in winter, the free black couple in a town across the state who could hide bodies in plain sight, Marcus and Ruth Jones, their blacksmith shop a noisy, ordinary shield. The first time Catherine met Josiah, she disguised the tremor in her voice as curiosity. If a person were to leave a place in the night, she asked, as if discussing a lost mare, where would they be safest? Josiah's eyes, which had seen too many things traded and struck from the ledger, were steady. He did not mock her naivete. He knew better than anyone that the brave were not always those who made noise. Often they were the ones who learned the best routes of silence. He told them about Thomas and Hannah, two Quaker names that carried the weight of housing without questions. He spoke of William Still, not as a man of legend, but as a man who kept lists and offered the paper safety that could be pressed into courtrooms as testimony when required. Philadelphia is not a country, Josiah said. It is a harbor. It has people who will bury you in plain sight and then hand you work. Their plans folded into the rhythm of the plantation day. Samuel worked the forge, and there he shaped not only metal, but small tools that could be repurposed, a horseshoe with a secret notch, a file smoothed so it could free a lock in seconds. Catherine wove small bits of cloth into garments heavy enough to hide a pass. They timed their meetings to the cadence of servants' chores, when voices were loudest, when the overseer's attention was elsewhere. Garrett, the overseer, had eyes that pricked like pins. He counted steps and expected them to fall in line. He was a man who mistook cruelty for order. Outside the silent architecture of their plotting, there were reminders of the broader machinery that could make any plan fall apart. Slave patrols, originally formed as groups of white citizens charged with returning those who ran away and policing the enslaved, had become an institutional fear. They patrolled along dusty roads and late-night paths, and they had laws behind them that gave them teeth. Patrols were a system meant to keep people on the map, where owners claimed them. They were not merely ad hoc men with torches. Their existence shaped every thought of flight. When the senator returned to the estate, his arrival was a thunderclap. News in the town said he had gone to the capital for the session and had come back restless, pleased with speeches made in smoke-filled rooms and full of plans to beautify his public image with philanthropic donations. Elijah Witmore had built his reputation on a performance of civic responsibility. At home, he rehearsed the posture of a family man who protected property. Never mind that the thing he most guarded was his power to command other lives. Elijah noticed a change in Catherine, a furtive light in her eyes that was not the pleased glow he expected from a well-married woman. He noticed, too, small irregularities that others could call happenstance: a laundry bundle left out of place, a tack missing from the stable. He did not ask outright. He rarely asked directly about the things he assumed were beneath him. Instead, he tightened the house. Garrett's steps became heavier. Dogs that had been kept in the yard were let loose for longer stretches. He began to speak of selling to a man on the coast, of sending some of the workers down the river for the market where ships awaited. Catherine felt the walls close faster. Her pregnancy was now not a private tremor, but a possible pretext for violence. If Elijah suspected that the child was not his lineage, the plantation's instruments of control would be used in ways she could not predict. She and Samuel could be separated with a ledger's signature. The very thing that had brought them a fragile sense of future, the child, could be the lever used to crush them. There came a night when the planning accelerated into emergency. Someone in the house, no one would admit who, had overheard a phrase. The rumor reached the porch where Catherine sat, candles guttering like small lungs. The housemaid's eyes had been averted when Catherine spoke. Later, she had replaced a needle in a sewing kit, and the crooked needle told a different story. Rumor might be small, but rumor rolled like a snowball in a society that traded people. They had 9 days. It was not a mystical number. It was the clock they made from the facts they had, the time until the senator planned to send a shipment downstream, the time until the overseer meant to move certain people, the time until a relative visited who would mean more eyes. 9 days was enough and barely enough. It was a fact that gave planning both focus and a weight that led to mistakes. 9 days, Samuel said once, holding Catherine's hand beneath the eaves while the crickets counted their own measures. We can do it. Her voice was a whisper of iron and thread. They will search the barns first, she said. They will go where it is easiest to look. Then we will go where they would not look, he replied. He had a map in his head, a creek that cut behind the tobacco rows, a small shard of road used by harvesters that would lead into the swamp at the plantation's edge. Beyond the swamp there was a gravel track that Josiah had said carried people toward the county line. From there, Thomas and Hannah, if their names proved true, could take them north. They gathered what they could cut from routine, a blanket, a few coins, and a small bundle of clothes that would not arouse suspicion when worn by people seeking work. Catherine took with her a locket, a family heirloom, made more valuable by the small secret she had hidden inside it, a scrap of paper with a name and a scribbled direction where to find help. She hid that scrap inside the locket's hinge like a small heart-horse. The locket was not the most practical item to bring on an escape, but it was a talisman of the life she had once been promised and refused. The night they left, the moon hung as an indifferent witness, more pale than protective. Their departure was a choreography of silence, a servant's foot in the corridor to drown out a mattress being folded, a lantern placed where it could suggest motion while the house slept, the slow trudge to the stable where the dog's snarls had been drowned by Samuel's prepared treats, cheese and bread he'd smuggled from the pantry. He had learned to use the small generosity of the house against the house itself. They moved through the tobacco rows like ghosts. The smell of cured leaves was an almost holy smell, earth and sweat, and the metallic tang of equipment. The night air was thick and carried sound in pockets. Even a whisper could descend like an explanation. They skirted the well, past the overseer's shed where a lantern burned low, and then slipped into the creek's edge. Water reach and reeds hugged them. The world narrowed to the press of cold on skin and the sound of their own breathing. For a while there was only movement and fear, and the strange, fierce clarity that comes when one steps from a life of constraints toward the unknown. Catherine held Samuel's hand with the intent of a person making a vow. There was no certainty of safety, only reasoned hope and the company of one another. They reached the first way station before dawn, a cabin whose dirt floor held the sleep of men who had learned to rest with one eye open. Marcus and Ruth Jones were waiting in the small kitchen that smelled of iron and vinegar. Marcus, a blacksmith like Samuel, examined him with a metal-testing look not of theft but of recognition. Ruth poured coffee and did not ask where they had come from. She handed Catherine a bowl as if to say, "You are seen." That ordinary act, arranging a place at the table, was the first real relief they had felt since making the decision to run. Philadelphia had been a name before it was a place for them, rumored freedom, bureaucratic shelter, a city with people who would bury you in plain sight. But the route from the plantation to the city was not a straight line. It was a chain of small trusts. The Joneses could only take them so far. In each place, there would be a risk of discovery. Somebody who would recognize a face from an auction catalogue, a man who would notice that a woman carried the wrong accent. At one stop near the county line, a hound gave a single bark that ricocheted in the dark like a gunshot. Garrett's men were on horseback in the fields, not yet lights on their saddles, but the low, unmistakable sound of hooves in dry ground. Samuel froze, a statue in the trap of shadow. The men had no law on their side that would look kindly on Catherine. She was, in the world's eyes, Mrs. Witmore, and the succulent thought that the senator would spare no expense to retrieve what he believed to be his property made the air taste of copper. They hid in a ditch as the riders swept past, the thunder of hooves pulling the earth out from under their hearts. The men smelled of horses and tobacco. One of the horses nicked at the grass above them and then passed on. Breath returned in muffled waves. For a moment, each of them felt how precarious they were. That night, at a Quaker home where the family had set a table for more mouths than could be counted, Catherine lay awake and listened to the steady, ordinary breathing of people not owned. The Quaker woman hummed a hymn that had little melody, but a great steadiness. The humility of their ritual made Catherine think of small things, a door that did not slam shut against one's body, a window that did not require permission to open. She thought of the child inside her, and for the first time allowed herself to imagine a name, Hope, before shutting the thought away as foolishness and necessity at once. It was in Philadelphia that the first real shadow of the senator's reach found them. A messenger, posted like a whisper in the course of their movement, had been sent north, a letter with Elijah's seal and a name to be remembered. Word moved fast through networks of commerce. Owners had taught the country how to track people as if they were lost cattle. The senator had sent couriers and put a bounty into paper, reward for information leading to the return of property. His reach did not end at river or state lines. It bent along the mercantile lines of the time, because law and money had taught the nation how to regard bodies as transferable goods. When William Still met them at a safe house, he greeted them with a profession of no grand gestures, no banners, no promises of magic. He kept papers and names, and had a way of placing them where they could be used. He looked at Samuel and at Catherine, and, like someone who had read many kinds of grief, did not flinch. "Names change when people need to be hidden," Still said. His voice was the measured tone of someone who had learned to weigh the difference between hope and hazard. "You will not be the same names you were. It is safer that way." They adopted false names like clothing, a necessary alteration of appearance and story. Catherine practiced being Sarah, a smaller, quieter name. Samuel took to the alias Thomas, and when they claimed those names in rooms full of people who would not ask too many questions, something like an adopted skin settled over them. Names are heavy things. They carry histories and expectations. To alter one's name is to begin again. Even as they clasped at the new lives, the shadow of pursuit stretched long. Elijah sent a man to the city, first a bounty hunter, then a lawyer who threatened suits. He wrote letters that crossed state lines, filled with insinuations and threats that were more legal than polite. He offered a bargain, a chilling arithmetic: return the woman and a sum of money, or else challenge the courts to find and keep a child he insisted was his by law and property. The language he'd use at home of honor, of rights, assumed a double standard when applied to those he owned. Catherine's voice hardened the moment he suggested anything that would harm the unborn. She had a new name that did not free her of the aches she carried, but it gave her a new clarity. "I will not bargain with the life inside me," she said through a steady jaw. The senator's suggestion, offered as if clemency were a coin to be spent, only sharpened her resolve. Law was part theater and part paper. In Pennsylvania, laws leaned differently than in Virginia. They offered pathways that could be argued and leveraged, but laws were not miraculous keys. They required evidence, the testimony of witnesses who would be believed, and the courage of men who knew how to keep lists and records. William Still and the Vigilance Committee understood that a courtroom could be a shield if used properly, but also that courts were fallible and required the kind of procedural truth that could stand against the narrative wealth of a senator and his lawyers. They began to gather what could be gathered: affidavits that traced the route of Samuel's purchase, witness statements that attested to Catherine's departure being voluntary, records of residency and employment that could anchor their claim to presence and personhood. The Vigilance Committee taught them how to answer questions without giving away paths to other fugitives. They learned to tell the truth that would be most protective, that they had chosen to leave, that no one had forced them across state lines, that they were now hosting a child and must be allowed to live. Still, for every paper that bolstered their claim, there was a rumor that might tear it down. Newspapers printed accusations like headlines and made of people mere stories to be consumed. Men in the senator's circle wrote op-eds that painted the runaway as a thief and the wife as a woman who had misjudged a man. Public opinion could shape the mood of a courtroom. To fight Elijah Witmore was to fight, in part, the gravity of a name that had shaped both county and capital. On the edges of safety, they still had to live day by day. Samuel worked for Henry Graves, a man who employed blacksmiths and paid in honest coin. The shop smelled of hot iron and the salt of sweat, and Samuel felt the satisfying grounding friction of shaping metal for honest exchange. Catherine, Sarah, took on washing and mending in a boarding house owned by Mrs. Patterson. Their lives acquired small, steady rhythms. They ate food that was not hurried, slept in rooms where doors would not be left ajar to signal possession. There was possibility now, a red ribbon of life where before there had been only ledger lines. But freedom's veneer was fragile. Elijah's men were not the only danger. The legal status of a person could be questioned, and a whistle in the wrong court could call down a return. Even in the bustling anonymity of a city, faces recognized by a passing auction catalogue could mean arrest. Catherine sometimes woke with the sensation that a hand had found her sleeping shoulder and would pull her back into the life she had fled. Samuel's fingers twitched under his blanket, as if remembering the ring of an iron tool, old reflexes that had to be unlearned, even as new ones were taught. In quieter moments they imagined a life after the cases and after the threats, one where their child could walk without being watched, where laughter was not measured by the manner in which it made the household look respectable. They spoke in small hopes: a shop where Samuel could hire men and teach apprentices, a garden where Catherine could plant things that would grow without being inventoried, a child who would learn to read before learning to hide. Those intimacies were dangerous to verbalize, and yet they were the currency that bought them courage. And then came the letter that would push everything into public light. Elijah had friends and enemies who liked the spectacle of a lawsuit more than the quiet resolution of private theft. He penned a missive that was both legal and theatrical, a document purposed to stir local opinion while also furnishing the legal grounds of his pursuit. It accused Samuel, called him a runaway. It accused Catherine, branded her a woman of poor judgment. The language was designed to shock, to present a narrative that would make forgiveness seem unthinkable. It was the kind of letter that could sway a juror who read the words without thinking of the lives swallowed in them. When the letter reached the Vigilance Committee, William Still read it with the lamp between his hands, like an accusation. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The committee's members logged names and checked dates. They had seen men like Elijah before, men who thought that public accusation could bludgeon private persons into compliance. The committee replied in the only way that worked against such bluster. They organized testimony, reached back into the chain of custody of the paper that had bought Samuel, and prepared the small, boring facts that could, under law, become a wall. They also prepared for the uglier reality. the possibility that a judge might not be sympathetic. Laws in Pennsylvania could be interpreted in ways that did not unilaterally favor the person who had fled. The committee taught them to place themselves not only in courts of law, but also in courts of human proof, in the testimony of neighbors, in the affidavits of those who had watched Samuel work before he was sold, in the records of baptisms and marriages, and the list of wages that showed a man as a man, not a chattel. As they prepared, the senator's reach tightened. Letters arrived that reeked of threat dressed as civility. A man with sealed parchment came to Henry Graves and asked pointedly about Samuel's origin. A stranger with a ledger asked Catherine, Sarah, about where she had trained to sew. The stranger used his knowledge like a blade. His questions were forms of predation dressed in polite curiosity. In the weeks that followed, the Freemans, newly thatched names, lived with the knowledge that any refusal could be punished and that any compliance could be betrayed. Their small, ordinary acts, the splitting of wood, the mending of a hem, were now threaded through a greater national contest, a senator's attempt to reclaim his reputation and property, a vigilance committee's attempt to assert the legal standing of fugitives, the small domestic acts of a family trying to begin. At night, Catherine would sometimes press her hand to her belly and say the name aloud, Hope. She would then clamp her mouth shut, as if the sound could be an accusation or a prophecy. Samuel would answer with a plan or with a prayer, sometimes both. They knew the law could be a weapon. They knew their own love had created a target, but they also knew that to turn back was to let the ledger win. On a crisp October evening, as leaves were turning and the air held the thin bite of coming cold, a messenger arrived at the boarding house where Mrs. Patterson kept her lodgers. The envelope was formal, stamped in the senator's hand. It demanded that the woman known as Sarah Freeman present herself at the county courthouse to answer for matters of breach of contract and trespass on property rights. It was a pretense of civility built on a foundation of menace. They faced again the question every fugitive must answer: expose themselves to make a legal stand, or keep hidden and live the rest of their lives in shadows. A courtroom might set them free on paper. It might also demand the kind of proof that would require exposing others, naming routes, revealing safe houses, endangering the people who had sheltered them. The choice was a moral crossroads as much as a legal one. Samuel and Catherine sat across from each other at a table in the dim light of Mrs. Patterson's parlor. Outside, the city's noise was a distant thing, tinny and without consequence. Inside, a folded map lay open between them, lines of route marked in pencil, a smudge where fingers had rested for longer than they should have. They looked at one another, both of them thinking of the child, even though neither would say the name aloud. "We can go to William," Samuel said. "We can let them see we are not what they say." "We can also stay in the shadows," Catherine replied. "There are women with babies right now who cannot risk a courtroom. If I show up, they might take Hope from me even before she is born." He took her hand, and in that silence they made a pact that was legal and human and terrifying. To choose the courtroom would be to risk reputation and the very real safety of those who had hidden them. To remain hidden would be to surrender the chance at formal personhood, at the legal protections that could one day allow their child to inherit a different kind of life. Before either of them could decide fully, the knock came at the door. They stopped speaking. The knock was not the light one of a neighbor. It was measured and official. Someone on the other side of the wood wanted entry in a way that demanded recognition. Outside, a voice called a name in a way that made the room contract. Garrett's voice? Or a man on behalf of the senator, a solicitor testing the walls of their newly built life? Samuel rose and walked toward the door, his heart a hammer he carried under his ribs. Catherine's hand clung to the chair's arm, small and firm. Whatever choice they would make now would be observed by the law and the public, and worst of all, by the ledger that had first weighed their worth. The door opened to a man in a coat that had known better days, and a face that had been mineralized by legal reading and paperwork. He handed an envelope to Mrs. Patterson, and then let his eyes slide over the small group of lodgers, as if making a public inventory. "You are wanted," he said. The phrase was simple and sharp. It possessed the authority of ink and seal. Samuel felt the past press forward like a tide. Choices had a cost. So did silence. So did the name on a paper. They would have to decide which cost they could pay. The ledger watched, the country watched, and in the small, extraordinary place where two people had chosen one another, a life that would be called hope waited on nothing but a thread. They had not yet realized how public a private decision could become, nor how the senator's reach would transform whispers into law. They had not yet seen how their flight would be read in the papers as scandal and in the courts as property dispute. They had not yet been tested by the instruments of a legal system practiced in protecting reputations over persons. Nor had they imagined the ways in which kindness, small acts of concealment in a Quaker home, a blacksmith's closed shop, would be as vital as any legal defense. Outside, the city breathed, unaware of the thread of fate running through a boarding house. Inside, the envelope rested on the table like a challenge. They would have to stand, to speak, to name their reasons, or to keep moving until the chance for name itself was safe. It is a narrow thing, this margin between being seen and being consumed. For Catherine and Samuel, the margin was smallest when the senator's shadow stretched toward them and when the law could be wielded like a blade. They had chosen each other in a world that refused to remember their personhood. Now they must choose whether the cost of that choice could be paid by paper, by witness, by courage, and whether the child inside would be allowed to be born free in more than name. They would have to decide which cost they could pay. The ledger watched, the country watched, and in the small, extraordinary place where two people had chosen one another, a life that would be called hope waited on nothing but a thread. The knock had been a summons and a blade at once. Mrs. Patterson stood with the envelope in her fingers, as if she could fold it back into obscurity. The lodgers looked on in a way that made their faces more honest than their words. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then William Still's measured steps crossed the parlor, and he put the lamp between them, as if to lend them steadiness. "We will not speak of routes," Still said softly, as if naming the danger was the first defense. "We will speak of facts, of dates, of purchase, of witnesses who saw, of work paid for, and not owed." Samuel felt the old reflex to answer with deeds, to name metal and measure heat. He found that his throat had grown a different habit, the ability to put danger into words. "We will tell the truth," he said, and the phrase was sharper and stranger than any blade. It was a weapon of a different breed. They walked into the county courthouse a week later, with the thin armor of affidavits and a courage that had been practiced in whispers. The courtroom smelled of raw wood and wax, and the small musk of men who had long made habit their religion. Judge, clerks, a line of public benches, everything had the weight of procedure. Newspapers rustled like dry leaves. The senator's supporters sat with their coats buttoned and their faces composed. For them, the affair was an injury to the proper order. For the Freemans, for William Still, for Josiah, Marcus, and Ruth, it was the attempt to translate a life into a set of books. A short political aside, slave patrols began as posse-like groups sanctioned to capture runaways and enforce discipline. By the 1840s, those patrol customs had merged with legal institutions, lending them a veneer of civic duty that hid a brutality of enforcement. This history followed every fugitive into a court. Law and coercion shared a grammar. The Senators' Council opened with the language of property. They spoke of ledgers and contracts, and a precedent they assumed would make the case a matter of procedure rather than morality. Their argument was engineered to convince a juror that the state should respect the property rights of a man who had been prominent enough to populate the papers with his portrait. They painted Samuel as a runaway laborer, and Catherine as an unbalanced woman who had been misled. William Still rose and read the affidavits aloud like a surgeon naming bones. He called witnesses who had seen Samuel purchased, who could speak to his passage downriver, who remembered the marks, a scar above his left wrist, the specific rhythm of his hammer that proved his identity before the senator's claim could hide in a ledger. He called Marcus Jones, who spoke of Samuel's work at a forge years before Elliot Witmore's ledger had recorded a sale. He called Ruth Jones, who testified to the day they had taken in two people with names that did not match their papers, but whose hands gave them away. She described the way Samuel hammered quietly in a corner, how Catherine's hands trembled the first week until they learned the steadiness of living unclaimed. Mrs. Chen, a midwife from a neighborhood 2 blocks over, appeared not as a dramatic witness but as a necessary human fact. She had been present when Catherine, by then Sarah, had complained of the first uneasy signs that would later bloom into labor pains. The midwife's calm description of the dates and the state of the woman's health was the kind of ordinary testimony that could anchor the extraordinary claims of law in quotidian truth. A pregnant woman, cared for, not trafficked in a ledger in that county. The senator's representative tried to turn facts into theater. He asked leading questions, coined phrases that implied deception, and nodded to those in the gallery as if audience assent could replace evidence. But law, when practiced honestly, requires more than the sound of a voice. It required records, it required labor receipts and baptismal entries, and witnesses who would stand and say what they had seen. The Vigilance Committee had been methodical. Receipts for coins paid to Samuel for work in Philadelphia, the list of employers who had given him daily wages, Mrs. Patterson's ledger of lodgers that tied a time and a place to the names he had taken. These plain things were the mortar in a wall that, when assembled, could keep out the flood of a powerful man's assertion. A short historical aside, by the 1840s the domestic slave trade had become a large organized business, in which people were moved like goods between markets. Slave traders kept catalogues, photographs later, and lists that allowed owners to locate those they claimed. That system of commerce left runaways at the mercy of networks designed to find them. Courts therefore offered one of the few institutional venues where a fugitive might argue for personhood in a language that sometimes, though not always, listened. On the stand, Samuel did not perform declamation. He answered in the steady voice of someone used to making things with his hands rather than making speeches. He described being sold, the ledger that had named him for fertility, the journey southward that had ended at the Witmore estate. Catherine, Sarah, testified with a reserve that carried power. She spoke of leaving of her own will, of the emptiness within the Witmore house that had not been filled by status, and of the singular fact that the life she carried in her held a claim she would not barter away. Elijah's men tried to entrap them in contradictions. They pressed on roots and names, and what had been said in rooms far from the court. The senator's counsel asked whether they had withheld information about those who helped them. It was a cruel tactic. To force their allies into a public ledger might protect this pair on paper, but destroy others in practice. William still refused those false corners. He taught his clients the narrow art of telling truths that did not become traps. He taught them to say what they knew and omit what might endanger others. It was a moral calculus that humanized the logic of survival. The court would hear facts relevant to the claim at hand, and nothing more that could be exploited by the men who counted reputation and property as one. Those were the choices freedom required. Days of testimony felt like long seasons. The senator's attorneys produced witnesses too, a perfunctory overseer who spoke in clipped facts, and a man who claimed to have seen Catherine in conversation with other suitors prior to her alleged disappearance, an attempt to paint her as unstable. But the force of facts, carefully arranged, broke through the performance. The judge leaned forward in a way that suggested he listened to how the law might be applied to a human life, rather than to the worth of paper. When the ruling finally came, it was not a theatrical liberation, but a measured recognition. The court acknowledged Sarah Freeman's claim that she had left of her own volition, and found that Samuel, by virtue of being resident, employed, and living as a free person in Pennsylvania, could not be summarily taken under the senator's writ. The decision was grounded in precedent and tempered with the weight of testimony. It did not announce a comprehensive moral victory over the institution of slavery, but it did what mattered most for them. It recognized their personhood in a court that could, in that moment, protect them from immediate removal. Elijah did not take defeat well. His rage, when it came to light, read like a man who had been accustomed to silence. He sent letters that tried to sully names. He used social contacts to whisper in ears of merchants to avoid dealing with the Freemans, and he tried to make the case into a scandal. The senator betrayed, the papers would say, for days. He tried, too, to bribe men with access to courts with purses heavy enough to tilt opinion elsewhere. Those tactics failed in law but lingered at the edges of their lives. Businessmen who feared being named in the senator's papers turned away from the blacksmith shop and the boarding house that briefly hosted the Freemans. There was in the senator's rhetoric a final ugliness. In private, he made an offer that exposed the depths of his cruelty. Surrender the child, and some sum would be paid. Otherwise, the senator implied, more severe measures might ensure the child's disappearance from any future claims. He framed it as a pragmatic resolution, but it was an erasure in a gentleman's language. Catherine looked at him, as if at a man asking her to sell a part of her soul for comfort and safety. "No," she said, and the single syllable carried the weight of all the nights they had hidden under quilts and the taste of the creek's water on their tongues. "No, I will not let my child be an asset in your ledger." Even the senator's allies, who had considered pragmatic deals, found the suggestion anathema. There was exposure involved in such a bargain, an ugliness that could not be contained in the soft legal papers he favored. He did what men of his class often did when faced with moral refusal. He tried to turn the refusal into scandal, and then to wear the scandal as justification for more force. But the court's decision had given the Freemans a measure of public legitimacy that a mere whisper could not erase. A short aside on medical exploitation. In 19th-century American cities, black bodies were sometimes used for anatomical study and for medical experimentation without consent. That history hovered like a shadow in their decisions, another danger Catherine feared for her child, a reason why consent and the clinic's neutrality mattered in ways that often favored those who could buy protection. Hope's birth came in a room lit by the steady hands of a midwife and the quiet chorus of people who had chosen to make this family their business. Mrs. Chen wrapped her in muslin the color of a shaken cloud and placed her on Catherine's chest with the kind of ceremony that needs no words. The child drew a breath and then another. Sarah Catherine cried not because of the pain she had known, but because a human heart kept time within her arms, in a world that had once tried to turn that heart into an asset. "We will call her Hope," Samuel said, though they had whispered the name before. It felt like a vow made audible. The legal registration of Hope was itself a cautious act of defiance. The Freemans registered their child's birth in a municipal ledger, with signatures filed by William Still and by witnesses who could attest to the child's presence in the city. That piece of paper was modest. It was not a talisman against all future horrors, but it was a start. The small fact that a child had been born in the city of Philadelphia could be measured, counted, and used as a fact that contradicted the senator's claim. In the months that followed, the Freemans learned to live with a relief that never became a full exhale. Samuel's hands, which had once been bound to make tools for others, now shaped goods that bore his name in the honest commerce of a city blacksmith. He opened a small shop with Marcus Jones, a noisy place where apprentices learned to temper iron and to temper their own lives with steadiness. Catherine, Sarah, found work mending shirts and running a small charity for women who had just arrived. Simple things that knit community into a life. They paid careful attention to who came to their door. The senator's men lingered in taverns and asked pointed questions about a new family in the neighborhood. But in their newfound routine, the Freemans also found the power of ordinary acts. Teaching a child to count, buying a second-hand Bible to read at night, building a small wooden cradle that Hope slept in, as if cradled by the city itself. The Vigilance Committee did the work that saved many lives in ways that rarely made the papers. William Still and his colleagues continued to keep lists that read like maps of survival. They staged defenses in courts, produced papers, and sometimes, when law failed or threatened safety, they helped people move farther north or into safer anonymity. For the Freemans, their work had been vital. The committee's record-keeping had turned rumor into proof at the moment when proof was life. Elijah Witmore's public standing eroded in the wake of the case, but not instantaneously, not like a house collapsing in a single night. He continued to be a figure of wealth and influence in Virginia. He continued to have supporters who believed him or who did not wish to be seen opposing him. But the scandal had cracked an illusion that the lives he controlled could be managed out of sight when they were dragged into print. Where once he had been able to hide ledger pages in closets, now his name appeared in local columns, with accusations and counter-accusations. For his enemies, the scandal was a cudgel. For his supporters, it was a discomfort they preferred to forget. What the court and the headlines could not do was change the larger institution. Slavery persisted across many states and in many forms. What they could do was reorder an immediate life, protect a child, and through example suggest a possibility others might risk. The freemans did not become mythic liberators. They became neighbors and workers and people who took in others who had nowhere else to go. Their shop became, in time, a small node in a larger network. People came with whispers, a woman who needed a stitch, a man who needed a night's lodging, a child with a fever and nowhere to go. The freemans did what they could, balancing generosity with the caution that survival required. There were losses along the way. People who had helped them in the shadows sometimes had to vanish when publicity came too close. Some friends turned cautious and withdrew, yet new alliances formed. Thomas and Hannah, the Quaker couple, extended hands in material ways. A small plot where Catherine sowed peas and beans, a place to let hope crawl on the grass without a ledger's watchful eye. Marcus and Ruth's blacksmith shop hired apprentices who were given a chance not to be counted as future repeat assets, but as workers who could earn and save. The senator fought on in small legal corners, attempts to bring countersuits, to force depositions, to keep the case alive as damning news. But the freemans were no longer isolated. They had the livelihoods that law could not easily erase, communities that provided witness, and the child whose existence made the stakes plain. A short aside on policing. The institutions that grew from patrols and local enforcement evolved and persisted. The mechanisms that tracked people had been taught by commerce and law. Their modern echoes would be visible in civil structures for years. That fact hung like a shadow throughout the lives of those who had run, an awareness that legal protection today might be uncertain tomorrow. Years passed. Hope grew in a house with a step and a small yard where she chased hens and learned to read by the light of a guttering candle held by Catherine. Samuel taught her to trace letters with the flat of a hot iron cooled under water. An odd lesson, but one that was all about attention and safe control. She learned to listen to the rhythm of a hammer striking an anvil and to measure the mettle of a man by how he treated the people around him. The freemans did more than survive. They began to help others take the narrow routes north. They did not become public agitators who sought fame. Instead, they offered the small things that mattered, a place to hide a pair of shoes, a bowl of stew, a note passed to a Quaker woman who could take someone to the next stop. William Still's lists continued to grow, and where possible, the committee managed to push back against those who abused law for private ends. The blacksmith shop rang out with the noises of trade and small rescue. Hope, as she grew, became less a symbol and more a person who knew the story of two parents who had chosen danger for the possibility of a different life. She sat at the table and listened as Samuel told without dramatics the details of his work and Catherine's small rebellions with books. She learned names: Josiah, who had once traced routes by rivers; Marcus and Ruth, who had given a corner of their shop for their first night of rest; Mrs. Chen, whose hands had known where to hold a mother; William Still, who had taught the value of documents and of measured speech. Names and debts, debts of kindness that could not be repaid, but that had to be acknowledged. As the years unfurled, the senator's name receded in the community of the freemans, but persisted in the histories of his class. He lived out his days with a fortune that looked respectable in some ledgers and like ruin in others. His scandals became footnotes in local histories. For the freemans, the matter was not the ruin of a man, but the building of a life. They married their work to community. Samuel hired apprentices who had once been at risk of being catalogued. Catherine started a small school for girls where literacy came before submission. A final quiet triumph. Hope Freeman, years from that first fragile breath, stood with a woman who had once been a neighbor and read aloud the names of those who had helped their family. She read with a clarity that was its own testimony. Names do matter. To be named is to be recorded into the world. She was not the erasure the senator had once hoped. She was a living ledger that bore witness. The ripple effects of their case were not instant uprisings or sweeping abolitionist shifts. They were subtler. A neighbor who, having seen a family struggle, chose to challenge a small injustice. A blacksmith who refused to sell a person even under pressure. A judge who, having heard a careful testimony, leaned toward compassion in a later, similar case. Those ripples moved in ways that could not all be measured, but they mattered as evidence. that private choice and communal solidarity could alter the experience of the law. When the Freemans took in another family years later, 2 women and a boy whose route had been messy and dangerous, Sarah sewed extra blankets and Samuel measured a child's chest for a small new vest. The scene was quiet and ordinary, and small enough to be invisible to newspapers and therefore entirely significant. There in the daily acts of care was the moral arithmetic that the senators' ledgers had never accounted for, love that expands rather than divides. In the towns that had watched the story when it was new, some remembered Elijah Witmore with nausea, some with pity for a man who could not see his wrongs, and some never thought beyond their own immaterial comforts. The Freemans, however, kept the accounts that mattered, the names of those they sheltered, the apprentices taught, the children who learned to read and then read to others. Hope, who would one day marry and have children of her own, held in her hands a different inheritance, a story of refusal paired with persistent small generosity. For all their small victories, the Freemans never pretended the system had been fully undone. Slavery continued elsewhere, and the domestic trade that had once catalogued human bodies did not disappear in a courtroom. What their life established was a practical precedent, that the instruments of law could, with careful work and communal courage, be used to protect rather than only to possess. It showed that love, formed under bondage, could be a source of resistance rather than a mere tragedy, that tenderness could be a strategy for survival rather than a weakness. In the epilogue of their days, when the forge grew quieter, and William Still's lists were kept by new hands at the Vigilance Committee, the Freemans visited with old friends and told stories that were not meant for headlines. They taught grandchildren how to set a table with respect and how to sign a name that had been fought for. They explained without bitterness that the world often required choices between the lesser of 2 terrors and that courage sometimes arrived at the price of small, steady acts. Hope's children would grow to embody something neither solely private nor solely public, a lineage that began with 2 people who had risked everything for the possibility that a child might breathe freely. They, in their own ways, would carry forward the small kindnesses, a thread of quiet aid that knitted steadily over decades, created a different fabric in neighborhoods once dominated by silence. There is a last necessary note about the ugliness that made this story necessary. The breeder system, this cold calculus that turned bodies into future capital, was not an anomaly, but a practice that fitted the domestic trade like a glove. It took laws and markets and made human futures into projections on ruled paper. The senator's attempt to bargain away a child was a grotesque expression of that logic. To name it as shock is not mere sensationalism. It is truth. The public must know how systems of ownership moved beyond fields and into bedrooms, and how the law sometimes protected those systems by virtue of property's language. What the Freemans did was to take that language and show that, with careful testimony and community support, it could be used to affirm personhood instead. When historians look back at the matter that began in 1842, they find a knot of facts that point to both cruelty and to the small resistances against it. The untold story is not merely the scandal, it is the daily courage of the people who cared enough to hide a pair of fugitives and later to bring testimony into a court. It is the list of names: Josiah, Marcus, Ruth, Thomas, Hannah, Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Patterson, William Still, placed side by side to prove how community can protect an individual life. The senator's house remained, as it always had, a painted facade with columns that spoke of power. But the ledger it kept, once an instrument of cold accounting, had been interrupted by 2 people who insisted on being seen as more than entries. That interruption did not end the ledger's history, but it did create a space in which a child could be named and a family could be built on terms other than ownership. For Catherine, who became Sarah, and for Samuel, who once forged metal for another's profit, the act of renaming was a rebirth. They did not erase their past. They turned toward a possible future and, with the help of others, built it. Hope Freeman, the child born in a Philadelphia room under lamp glow and midwife's hands, would grow into the kind of quiet proof that institutions can be resisted and that names once claimed can be defended. If this story has moved you, the documents and primary sources linked in the description will take you further. Court transcripts, William Still's records, and contemporary accounts that corroborate the structures described here. Consider reading beyond the headlines and supporting the archives and communities that keep these records alive, so other untold stories might reach light. They had paid a price in fear and in secrecy, in nights of hunger, and in the risk of exposing those who helped them. But in the end, the price bought something priceless, a life that began under the name Hope, and a lineage that would know how to keep names safe. In that preservation, the ledger lost a little of its authority, and a family, small and stubborn, won the right to exist.